Swann's Way, Swan in Love, Part 4, by Marcel Proust. He placed on his work table, as if it were a photograph of Odette, a reproduction of Jethro's daughter. He would gaze in admiration at the large eyes, the delicate features, in which the imperfection of her skin might be surmised, the marvelous locks of hair that fell along her tired cheeks, and, adapting what he had already found to be beautiful on aesthetic grounds to the idea of a living woman, he converted it into the physical merits that he congratulated himself on finding assembled in the person of one whom he might ultimately possess. The vague feeling of sympathy that draws us to a masterpiece that we are looking at now that he knew the original in the flesh of Jethro's daughter became a desire that more than compensated henceforth for the desire that Odette's body had, at first, failed to inspire in him. When he had gazed for a long time at this Botticelli, he would think of his own living Botticelli, who seemed all the lovelier in contrast, and as he drew toward him the photograph of Zippora, he would imagine that he was clasping Odette against his heart. It was not only Odette's lassitude, however, that he must take pains to circumvent. It was also at times his own, feeling that since Odette had had every facility for seeing him, she seemed no longer to have very much to say to him when they did meet. He was afraid that the manner, at once trivial, monotonous, and seemingly unalterable, that she now adopted when they were together might ultimately destroy in him that romantic hope for a day when she would declare her passion, which alone had made him fall and remain in love. And so, to revive somewhat Odette's moral aspect, which was too unchanging and of which he was afraid of tiring, he wrote suddenly a letter full of feigned disappointments and simulated anger, which he sent off so that it would reach her before dinner time. He knew that she would be frightened and that she would reply, and he hoped that when the fear of losing him clutched at her heart, it would force from her words such as he had never yet heard her utter. And he was right. By repeating this device, he had won from her the most affectionate letters that she had so far written him. One of them, which she had brought to him at midday by a messenger from the Maison d'Henri, it was the day of the Paris Mercy Fête given for the victims of the recent floods in Mercia, began with these words: "My dear, my hand trembles so that I can scarcely write." He had kept this letter in the same drawer as the withered chrysanthemum. Or else, if she had not had the time to write, when he arrived at the Védérans, she would come running up to him and would say, "I have to talk to you." And he would contemplate with curiosity on her face and in her words what she had hitherto kept concealed from him of her heart. Even as he drew near to the Védérans' door and caught sight of the great lamp-lit windows, whose shutters were never closed, whom he would see, as he would begin to melt at the thought of the charming creature whom he would see as he entered the room, radiant in that golden light. Here and there the figures of the guests stood out, sharp and black, between lamp and window, shutting off the light, like those little pictures that one sees sometimes pasted here and there on a glass screen, whose other panes are mere transparencies. He would try to make out Odette's silhouette, and then, when he was inside, without thinking, his eyes sparkled suddenly with such radiant happiness that Monsieur Védéran said to the painter, "It seems to be getting warm." Indeed, for Swann, her presence gave the house what none other of the houses that he visited seemed to possess, a sort of sensitive apparatus, a nervous system that ramified into each of its rooms and sent a constant stimulus to his heart. And so the simple and regular manifestations of a social organism that was the little clan were transformed for Swann into daily encounters with Odette, and enabled him to feign indifference to the prospect of seeing her, or even a desire not to see her, in which he ran no great risk, since, even though he had written to her during the day, he would of necessity see her in the evening and accompany her home. But one evening, When, irritated by the thought of that inevitable dark drive together, he had taken his young working girl all the way to the Bois so as to delay as long as possible the moment of his appearance at the Védérans, he was so late in reaching them that Odette, supposing that he did not intend to come, had already left. Seeing that she was no longer in the drawing-room, Swann felt his heart wrung by a sudden anguish. He trembled at being deprived of a pleasure whose intensity he began to measure for the first time, having had until then that certainty of finding it whenever he wished, which, in the case of all pleasures, diminishes them for us or even prevents us from seeing at all their greatness. "Did you notice the face he pulled when he saw that she wasn't here?" Monsieur Védéran asked his wife. "I think we may say that he's hooked." "The face he pulled?" exploded Dr. Cottard, who, having left the house for a moment to visit a patient, had just returned to fetch his wife and did not know whom they were discussing. "Do you mean to say you didn't see him on the doorstep? The loveliest of swans?" "No. Monsieur Swann has been here?" "Oh, just for a moment. We had a glimpse of a swan tremendously agitated, in a state of nerves. You see, Odette had left." "You mean to say that she has gone all the way with him? That she has hauled his ashes?" inquired the doctor cautiously, testing the meaning of his phrases. "Why, of course not. There's absolutely nothing to it. In fact, between you and me, I think she's making a great mistake and behaving like a silly little fool, which she is, incidentally." Come, said Monsieur Védéran. "How on earth do you know that there's nothing going on? We haven't been there to see, have we now?" "She would have told me," answered Madame Védéran with pride. "I may say that she tells me everything. As she has no one else at present, I told her that she ought to sleep with him. She makes out that she can't. She admits she was immensely attracted to him at first, but he's always shy with her, and that makes her shy with him. Besides, she doesn't care for him in that way. That he's an ideal love. She's afraid of rubbing the bloom off the feeling she has for him. Oh, I don't know half the things she says. How should I? And yet, that's exactly what she needs." "I beg to differ with you," said Monsieur Védéran. "I am only half satisfied with the gentleman. I feel that he poses." Madame Védéran's whole body stiffened. Her eyes stared blankly as though she had suddenly been turned into a statue, a device by means of which she might be supposed not to have heard that unbearable word, poses, which seemed to imply that it was possible for people to pose in her house, and therefore that there were people in the world who were better than they. "Anyhow, if there's nothing to it, I don't suppose it's because our friend believes she's virtuous," Monsieur Védéran said ironically. "And yet, you never know. He seems to believe that she's intelligent. I don't know whether you heard the way he lectured her the other evening about Venti's sonata. I like Odette with all my heart, but really, to expound theories of aesthetics to her, the man must be a prize idiot." "Look here, I won't have you saying bad things about Odette," broke in Madame Védéran, playing the child. "She is charming." "There's no reason why she shouldn't be charming. We are not saying anything bad about her, only that she is not the embodiment of either virtue or intelligence. After all," he turned to the painter, "does it matter so very much whether she is virtuous or not? You can't tell. She might be a great deal less charming if she were." On the landing, Swann had run into the Védéran's butler, who had been somewhere else a moment earlier when he arrived, and who had been asked by Odette to tell Swann, but that was at least an hour ago, in case he should still come, that she would probably stop for a cup of chocolate at Proust's on her way home. Swann set off at once for Proust, but every few yards his carriage was held up by others or by people crossing the street. Odious obstacles, each of them he would gladly have crushed beneath his wheels, were it not that a police officer's report would delay him even longer than the actual passage of the pedestrian. He counted the minutes, adding a few seconds to each, so as to be sure he had not made them too short, and so possibly exaggerated whatever chance there might actually be of his arriving at Provost's in time, and of finding her still there. And then, in a moment of illumination, like a man in a fever who awakes from sleep and is conscious of the absurdity of the dreams among which his mind had been wandering without any clear distinction between himself and them, Swann suddenly perceived how foreign to his nature were the thoughts that he had been revolving in his mind ever since he had heard at the Védéran's that Odette had left, how new the heartache from which he was suffering, but of which he was only now conscious, as though he had just woken up. What? All this disturbance simply because he would not see Odette until tomorrow, exactly what he had been hoping, not an hour before, as he drove toward Madame Védéran's. He was obliged to admit also that now, as he sat in the same carriage that was taking him to Provost's, he was no longer the same man, was no longer alone even, but that a new person was there beside him, adhering to him, amalgamated with him, a creature of whom he might not be able to rid himself, whom he may have to treat with great deference as one does a master or a malady. And yet, since the moment in which he had felt that a new person was thus conjoined with him, life seemed more interesting. It was in vain that he assured himself that this possible meeting at Provost's, the tension of waiting for which so ravaged, stripped so bare the intervening moments that he would find nothing, not one idea, not one memory that might ease his mind, would probably, after all, were to take place, be much the same as all their other meetings, of no great importance. As on every other evening, once he was in Odette's company, once he had begun to cast furtive glances at her changing countenance, and instantly to withdraw his eyes for fear that she would read in them the first signs of desire and believe no more in his indifference, he would cease to be able to even think of her, so busy would he be in the search for pretexts that would enable him not to leave her immediately, and to assure himself, without betraying his concern, that he would find her again next evening at the Védéran's. Pretexts, that is to say, which would enable him to prolong, for the time being, and to renew for one day more the disappointment and the torture that must always come to him with the futile presence of this woman, whom he might approach, yet never dared embrace. She was not at Provost's. He must search for her. Then, in every restaurant on the boulevards. To save time, while he went in one direction, he sent in the other his coachman Remy, Rizos Doge Loredan, for whom he waited after fruitless search at the spot where the carriage was to meet him. It did not appear, and Swann pictured the approaching moment as one in which Remy would say to him, "Sir, the lady is there," or as one in which Remy would say to him, "Sir, the lady was not in any of the cafes." And so, he saw the end of the evening before him, one and yet divided, preceded either by discovering Odette, which would put an end to his agony, or by being forced to abandon any hope of finding her that evening, and accepting the necessity of returning home without having seen her. The coachman returned, but as he came up to Swann, the latter did not say to him, "Did you find the lady?" but, "Remind me tomorrow to order in some more firewood. I am sure we must be running short." Perhaps he had persuaded himself that if Remy had at last found Odette in some café, where she was waiting for him still, then his night of misery was already obliterated by the realization, begun already in his mind, of a night of joy, and that there was no need for him to hasten toward the attainment of a happiness already captured and held in a safe place, which would not escape his grasp again. But it was also by the force of inertia. There was in his soul the lack of suppleness that can be seen in the bodies of certain people who, when the moment comes to avoid a collision, to snatch their clothes out of the reach of a flame or to perform an urgent movement, take their time, begin by remaining for a second in their original position, as though seeking to find in their fulcrum their momentum. And probably, if the coachman had interrupted him with, "I have found the lady," he would have answered, "Oh, yes, of course. That's the errand that I send you on. Really, I wouldn't have thought it." And would have continued to discuss his supply of firewood, so as to hide from his servant the emotion that he had felt, and to give himself time to calm his anxiety and abandon himself to pleasure. The coachman came back, however, with the report that he could not find her anywhere, and added the advice as an old and privileged servant, "I think, sir, that all we can do now is go home." But the air of indifference which Swann could so lightly assume when Remy uttered his final unalterable response vanished when he saw Remy attempt to make him abandon hope and the quest. "Certainly not," he exclaimed. "We must find the lady. It is most important. She would be extremely annoyed, it's a business matter, and offended if she didn't see me." "But I do not see how the lady can be offended, sir," answered Remy, "since it was she who left without waiting for you, sir, and said she was going to Provost's and then wasn't there." Meanwhile, the restaurants were closing, and their lights began to go out. Under the trees of the boulevards, there were still a few people strolling to and fro, barely distinguishable in the gathering darkness. Now and then, the shadow of a woman approached Swann, murmured a few words in his ear, asked him to take her home, and left him shuddering. Anxiously, he passed close to each of these vaguely seen shapes, as though among the phantoms of the dead in the realms of darkness he had been searching for Eurydice. Among all the methods by which love is brought into being, among all the agents that disseminate this blessed bane, there are so few efficacious as the great gust of agitation which now and then sweeps over us. For then the die is cast, and the woman whose company we are enjoying at that moment is one whom we will henceforth love. It is not necessary that she should have pleased us up till then, any more or even as much as others. All that is necessary is that our taste for her should become exclusive, and that condition is fulfilled in the moment when she fails to appear, and for the pleasures that we were on the point of enjoying in her charming company is abruptly substituted an anxious, torturing desire, whose object is the woman herself, an irrational, absurd desire, which the laws of this world make it impossible to satisfy and difficult to assuage. The insane, agonizing desire to possess her. Swann made Remy drive him to the restaurants that were still open. It was the sole hypothesis now of that happiness which he had contemplated so calmly. He no longer concealed his agitation. The price he set on their meeting, and promised, in case of success, to reward his coachman as though by inspiring in him a will to succeed that would reinforce his own, he could bring it to pass that Odette, assuming that she had long since gone home to bed, might yet be found seated in some restaurant on the boulevards. He pushed on as far as the Maison Dorée, went twice into Tortoni's, and still, without catching sight of her, was emerging from the Café Anglaise, striding with a haggard gaze toward his carriage, which was waiting for him at the corner of the Boulevard des Italiens, when he collided with a person coming in the opposite direction. It was Odette. She explained later that there had been no room at Provost's, that she had gone instead to sup at the Maison Dorée and had been sitting there in an alcove where he must have overlooked her, and that she was now going back to her carriage. She had so little expected to see him that she started back in fear. As for him, he had run all over Paris, not that he supposed it possible that he would find her, but because he would have suffered even more cruelly by abandoning the attempt. But now this joy, which his reason had never ceased to regard for that evening as unattainable, only seemed to him now more real, for he had contributed nothing to it by anticipating probabilities. It remained external to him. There was no need for him to draw on his own resources to endow it with truth. It was from itself that there emanated. It was itself that projected toward him that truth whose rays melted like a dream the loneliness he had dreaded. That truth on which he had supported rested, albeit unconsciously, his vision of bliss. So will a traveler who has come down on a day of glorious weather to the Mediterranean shore and is doubtful whether they will still exist, whose lands which he has left, let his eyes be dazzled, rather than cast a backward glance, by the radiance streaming toward him from the luminous and unfading azure of the sea. He climbed after her into the carriage that she had kept waiting and ordered his own to follow. She had in her hand a bunch of cattleyas, and Swan could see beneath her lace scarf that she had in her hair flowers of this same orchid fastened to a plume of swan's feathers. She was wearing under her cloak a flowing gown of black velvet, caught up on one side so as to reveal a large triangular patch of her white silk shirt, with an insertion also of white silk in the cleft of her low-necked bodice, in which were fastened a few more cattleya flowers. She had scarcely recovered from the shock that the sight of Swan had given her, when some obstacle made the horse start to one side. They were thrown forward from their seats. She uttered a cry and fell back, quivering and breathless. "It's all right," he assured her. "Don't be frightened." And he slipped his arm around her shoulders, holding her body against his own to support her. Then he said, "Whatever you do, don't utter a word. Just make a sign, yes or no, or you'll be even more out of breath. You won't mind if I put the flowers straight on your bodice. The jolt has loosened them. I'm afraid if they're dropping out. I'm just going to push them in a little farther." She was not used to men making such a fuss over her, and smiled as she answered, "No, not at all. I don't mind in the least." But he, intimidated by her answer, perhaps also to bear out the pretense that he had been sincere in adopting the stratagem, or even because he was already beginning to believe that he had been, exclaimed, No, you mustn't speak. You will be out of breath again. You can easily answer by signs. I will easily understand, really and truly now. You don't mind my doing this? Look, there is a little, I think it must be pollen, spilled over your dress. May I brush it off with my hand? That's not too hard. I'm not hurting you, am I? I'm tickling you perhaps a little, but I don't want to touch the velvet in case I rub it the wrong way. But don't you see, I really had to secure the flowers. They would have fallen out if I hadn't, like that now. If I just push them a little farther down, seriously, I'm not annoying you, am I? And if I just sniff them to see whether they really have any scent? I don't believe I ever smelled any before. May I? Tell the truth. Now. Still smiling, she shrugged her shoulders ever so slightly, as to say, "You're quite mad. You know very well that I like it." He slipped his other hand upward along Odette's cheek. She fixed her eyes on him with that languishing and solemn air that marks the women of the Florentine master, in whose faces he had found such resemblance to hers. Swimming at the brink of her eyelids, her brilliant eyes, wide and thin like theirs, seemed on the verge of breaking from her face like two tears. She bent her neck, as all their necks may be seen to bend, in the pagan scenes as well as in the religious paintings, and, in an attitude that was doubtless habitual, one which she knew to be appropriate to such moments, and was careful not to forget to assume. She seemed to need all her strength to hold her face back, as though some invisible force were drawing it toward Swann's. And Swann, it was who, before she allowed her face, as though despite her efforts to fall on his lips, held it back for a moment longer, at a little distance between his hands. He had intended to leave time for his thoughts to catch up, to recognize the dream they had cherished for so long, and to be present at its realization, like a relative invited as a spectator when a prize is given to the child whom she dearly loves. Perhaps, too, Swann was fixing on these features of an Odette not yet possessed, not even kissed by him, on whom he was looking now for the last time, that gaze with which, on the day of his departure, a traveler strives to bear away with him the view of a country to which he will never return. But he was so shy with her that, having finally possessed her that evening, which had begun by his arranging her cattleyas, whether from fear of offending her or from reluctance to appear even retrospectively to have lied, or perhaps because he lacked the audacity to formulate a more urgent requirement than this, which could always be repeated since it had not annoyed her. On the first occasion, he resorted to the same pretext on the following days. If she had any cattleyas pinned to her bodice, he would say, "It is most unfortunate. The cattleyas don't need tucking in this evening. They've not been disturbed as they were the other night. I think, though, that this one isn't quite straight. May I see if they have more scent than the others? Or else, if she had none." "Oh, no cattleyas this evening, then there's no way for me to indulge in my little arrangements." So that for some time there was no change from the procedure that he had followed on that first evening, when he had started by touching her throat with his fingers and then with his lips, and it was with them that his caresses began each time. And long afterward, when the arrangement, or rather the ritual pretense of an arrangement, of her cattleyas had quite fallen into desuetude, the metaphor do a cattleya transmuted into a simple verb which they would employ without thinking about it when they wished to refer to the act of physical possession, in which, moreover, one possesses nothing, survived to commemorate in their intimate language the forgotten custom. And yet possibly this particular way of saying to make love did not mean exactly the same thing as its synonyms. However disillusioned we may be about women, however we may regard the possession of even the most divergent types as an invariable experience, every detail of which is known in advance, it still becomes a fresh and stimulating pleasure if the women concerned be, or be thought to be, so difficult as to oblige us to initiate the possession of her by some unforeseen incident in our relations with them, as was originally for Swann the arrangement of the cattleyas. He trembled as he hoped that evening, but Odette, he told himself, if she were deceived by his stratagem, could not guess his intention, that it was the possession of this woman that would emerge for him from their large mauve petals, and the pleasure that he already felt, and that Odette tolerated, he thought, perhaps only because she was not yet aware of it herself, seemed to him for that reason, as it might have seemed to the first man when he tasted it amid the flowers of the earthly paradise, a pleasure that had never before existed, that he was striving now to create, a pleasure, just as the special name that he gave it preserved its origin, entirely individual and new.